On Wednesday, the 4th of January 1956, one of the largest police investigations Scotland had ever seen began, when the body of a young woman was discovered on a golf course in East Kilbride. The investigation would last 2 years and was first led by Detective Chief Superintendent James Hendry of Lanarkshire CID. January the 4th was cold and sunny. George Gribben took a walk through a wooded area within a golf course. As he approached, he noticed a figure lying on the ground. Upon closer inspection, his stomach churned at what he saw. A terrified Gribben ran towards the nearby road, where he came across some gasboard engineers working. A panic-stricken Gribben spluttered out what he had come across, but the workers didn't take him seriously, except maybe one of them, who had a darkness about him. A distraught Gribben ran to nearby Calder Glen Farm and called the police. When the first policemen arrived, they saw the horrific scene where the young woman's body lay. Looking around, they saw what they believed was her running footprints in the mud, where she had tried to run for her life from the perpetrator of the crime. Her clothes were ripped and torn, possibly from the barbed wire she had desperately tried to crawl through. Her shoes lay in a ditch. It looked as if she'd tried to run and got about 400 yards before she was attacked and indecently assaulted. Her blue pants were missing and her head had been smashed in from repeated blows. The woman was identified as 17-year-old garment worker Anne Kneilands. Anne had lived with her parents on the Calderwood estate. As it was the Hogmanay holidays, she and her sister Alice had gone dancing with friends on the 30th of December. She met a young soldier, Andrew Murren, who was home on leave. They arranged to meet on the following Monday, 2nd of January, at 6 p.m. at Calpel Rig Farm bus stop, not far from her home. The soldier was a no-show, but she waited and waited, but by 6:20 she gave up and visited her friends, the Simpsons, before catching the bus going towards East Kilbride at 6:44. She got off the bus at a stop that was opposite a cafe where the local teens used to like to hang out. She was later seen waiting with some others, catching the 7:10 bus home. It would be the last time she was seen alive. She didn't return home that night, but her parents did think that she was staying at a friend's home, so they didn't worry too much until they discovered she hadn't been seen since the bus journey. Her disappearance was reported on the morning of the 4th of January. After Anne's body had been found, a full-scale murder investigation began with every available officer on the case. The young soldier Anne had arranged to meet was grilled, but he had been drinking for most of the day when he had met Anne, and he couldn't remember even making the arrangement to meet up. On the 4th of January, Constable James Marr spoke to the foreman of the gasboard gang, who had been working near where the body had been found. A new housing estate was being built, and they were digging pipelines to provide gas to the new homes. The foreman informed him that one of his workers, Peter Manuel, had scratches on his face that were not there before the 2nd of January. Manuel claimed he'd got them in a fight in Glasgow. The information was recorded but didn't seem to go any further. No other evidence against Manuel or anyone else could be found. Anne's case went cold, but another murder was on the horizon in Glasgow. Middle-aged spinster Anne Steele, a bookkeeper living in a flat on Aberfoyle Street, East Glasgow, was found in her flat on the 11th of January 1956, after her neighbours heard crashing noises coming from her flat that evening and called the police. Miss Steele was found deceased from a head wound. The object used was clearly the poker found laying near the fireplace. The assailant had fled through an open bathroom window and scaled 60 feet down a drainpipe. A description of a man seen walking from the direction of the flat was taken. It would be years later that the detective on the case spoke, claiming he believed Peter Manuel was responsible, but there was no evidence, and the case would never be solved. June the 15th, working girl Ellen Petrie was found deceased behind some buildings in Glasgow city centre. The description of the assailant fitted Manuel, but no evidence once again could be found, and the case went cold. All of these first cases were thought to have been committed by Peter Manuel, but try as they might, the police had no evidence against him. On Monday, the 17th of September 1956, Helen Collison, a housekeeper, arrived at the home of the Watt family, a bungalow on Fensbank Avenue, Burnside, just outside of Glasgow. William Watt, owner of Dean Home Bakeries, lived there with his wife Marion and 16-year-old daughter Vivian. The arrangement had always been that Mrs. Collison would let herself in through the back door, that Vivian would leave unlocked when she left for college. But on this day all the doors were locked, and Mrs. Collison couldn't get the attention of anyone in the house. When she got to the front door, she saw one of the panes of glass had been broken. Now worried, she saw the postman doing his rounds and asked him for his help. He reached through the glass hole and unlatched the door. He led the way, walking into the first bedroom. They saw the two ladies, Mrs. Watt and her sister, who was staying with her while Mr. Watt was away on a short fishing holiday, still laying on the bed, the sheets now stained red from their head injuries. In the other room they found young Vivian, also still in bed, and also deceased from her head injuries. It would later be found that the assailant had caused more injuries to Vivian, showing the person had tormented her, possibly before the assailant took her life. While Mr. Watt was out fishing, the hotel manager where he was staying took a call from Mr. Watt's brother, who told her what had happened. She sent a taxi out to where Mr. Watt was fishing with a message for him to return as quickly as possible, as there was an urgent message for him. When he returned to the hotel, the manageress, Mrs. Leach, was incredibly upset. She eventually managed to say his wife's name. This prompted him to call his brother, who was already on his way to the house, but his secretary told him the awful news. In disbelief, he called his home, where a police officer confirmed what had happened. Without a second thought, he made his way back to the home, accompanied by an officer. As the journey was arduous and Mr. Watt was in a bad way, it was advised to pull in at Alexandria, where a police driver took him to the outskirts of Glasgow. DS William Mitchell and PC Copland from Lanarkshire Police escorted him the rest of the way. Once reaching the Rutherglen police station, he was escorted to the mortuary to identify his wife, daughter and sister-in-law. The media did their thing, bombarding all those they thought could give them some information, no matter how big or small. A full-scale investigation began. Just down the road from the awful scene lived two sisters who had gone away for a few days, leaving the keys to their property with a trusted neighbour. Mrs. Agnes Brown noticed a window pane on the front door broken and immediately went to the police, who were investigating at the Watt house. Constable Steele went to help, letting himself in by reaching through the broken pane. After seeing an obvious break-in, he called the CID over. Inside the house was a familiar scene, one they had come across before. A tin of soup had been opened and poured over the living room floor. Also a tin of spaghetti had been opened and just thrown all over. The rooms were ransacked. On one end of the sofa there were visible dirty boot marks, and on the carpet nearby there was a burn mark indicating that someone had been smoking while lying on the sofa and put the cigarette out on the carpet. 2 gold rings were missing and a small amount of money, but oddly more expensive items had been left. As the police had seen this sort of break-in before, and who had been responsible for those break-ins, Peter Manuel was immediately suspected. Why? Well, let's look at his previous record and his early days. Samuel Manuel from Hamilton married pregnant Bridget Greenan in 1923. For one reason or another, Samuel decided that life might be better in the US, so took himself off to find work, leaving a heavily pregnant Bridget behind. After the birth of their first child, James, Bridget set off to New York to join her husband, leaving the child in the care of her mother. On March the 15th, 1927, Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel was born in Manhattan. Things, it would seem, didn't go very well, as 2 years later the family had returned to Scotland to live in Motherwell. The family, being Catholic, sent their children to Our Lady of Good Aid Primary School in Motherwell. It was later claimed by his brother that Peter was placed in a class of older children who picked on him because he couldn't keep up. In 1937 the family grew when Teresa was born, and they moved down to Coventry, where the motor trade seemed to be doing well and Samuel could get work. In 1940 they would return to Motherwell after their house had been bombed, but Peter wasn't with them. Manuel had committed his first recorded crime at the age of 11 when he broke into a church and stole money. In 1939 he was bound over for 12 months after he broke into a shop and stole items. Just a few weeks later he was caught breaking and entering again, and this time he was sentenced to spend time at an approved school, following in his older brother's footsteps, who had also spent time in an approved school. He was sent to St William's Approved School at Market Weighton in Yorkshire. The report from his teachers provides valuable insights into his behaviour. They describe him as cunning and deceitful and good at appearing innocent. It was challenging to believe him, and he often took on the role as a leader among his peers and constantly tried to pass the blame on to others. He consistently demonstrated a strong desire to do as he pleased and go wherever he wanted. He was once caught trying to get a ticket to Glasgow before a court appearance for a break-in. Almost from the start he ran away and continued to do so over and over again. Each time he got away, he committed crime after crime. It would seem that Peter's lack of empathy towards those he terrorised left this cold and calculated child happy and content, as was reported by his school. Although Peter had more than one evaluation regarding his mental state, the report showed that no mental abnormalities could be found. His psychopathic tendencies showed through from an early age. On one occasion in 1941, at the age of 14, when absconding from the school again, he broke into a home where the lady of the house saw him carrying an axe. On a separate occasion in 1942, he broke into a house where a woman was sleeping peacefully. Suddenly, she woke up to the horrifying sight of Manuel striking her repeatedly on the head. The vicious attack left her with a concussion and a severe hemorrhage, which required her to be in hospital for a significant period of time. When he was eventually apprehended and questioned about this, Manuel astonishingly professed ignorance as to the motive behind his actions. This pattern of behaviour concerning the striking over the head, as we know, became more vicious as his constant break-ins continued. September 1942 he was charged again with housebreaking and absconding from the approved school. Consequently, he was sentenced to do another 6 months there. 10 days later, he appeared at court in Beverley, Yorkshire, where he was charged once again with housebreaking and theft of a bike. November, he was up in court once again, charged with another break-in. At 15, Manuel was a prolific absconder, thief, brutal thug, and lacked any moral consideration towards others. His violence escalated when he grabbed a woman, in fact it was the wife of a member of staff at the school. He hit her over the head with a stick, dragged her into some woods close to the school, removed her clothing and tried to force himself on her, but stopped. The woman was left with a broken nose and shoulder. Manuel, while still at the approved school, went on a rampage in one of the rooms, which would become one of his signatures Well, sort of. He ripped bedsheets and clothing and threw stuff around the room. So as time went on, it became clear that when he broke into homes, he would not only stub out cigarettes on furniture, but also create as much chaos as possible using whatever objects he found. His motive seemed to be solely to inflict distress upon the homeowners. After the assault on the woman at the school, Manuel was sent to Hollesley Bay Borstal Farm, run by ex-servicemen. Far from being a strict run centre, the governor took an interest in the welfare of the inmates. They were set to work on the farm and taught certain skills that they hoped would help the offender when released, such as woodworking classes that Manuel took. An official at the Borstal noticed that Manuel was a terrible liar, although Manuel himself was unaware of it. While others easily detected his exaggerated version of events, Manuel believed his fabrications seemed believable. He skillfully weaved his blatant lies into conversations, and having an excellent memory, he managed to minimise the chances of getting caught out. It was also written that he had some likeable qualities, especially when he turned on his charm. But it wasn't long before the young Manuel would abscond again. In July 1943, he was caught housebreaking. After spending a night in the jail, he was returned to the Borstal. Manuel was released in 1945 and returned to live with his family. The world was still at war, and army draft papers were sent out to Manuel, but it was seen he didn't respond to them and it wasn't followed up. It's believed he tried to enlist in the US Army, but was refused, possibly because of his record. But staying home wasn't what Manuel wanted at that time, so he took himself to Blackpool. The golden sands and flamboyant arcades bustling with holidaymakers, and Manuel took his place working through the season at the arcades. Once the season closed, he returned to his parents, who had now moved into a new home with better conditions. But Manuel couldn't settle into his parents' routine of working life and constant struggle. It wouldn't take long for Manuel to find himself immersed into the underworld, where he was more than happy to be. Crime was now his career. He revelled in it and enjoyed making a living from his deeds. He had no fear, no feelings of remorse towards victims whatsoever. He gave up the toil of honest labouring work, finding thieving more lucrative. In a short space of time, he committed a number of thefts, one after the other, close to his home in Motherwell. On the 24th of May 1945, he broke into a house which was followed by 3 more on the 28th, the 30th and the 31st. He went on to break into 7 homes closely connected to his parents' home. One home he broke into in January 1946 was on Sheepburn Road, Uddingston, number 29 to be exact, where he stole some valuable items as well as some smaller items from the property. But the address becomes more significant at a later date. As the world was still recovering from wartime, theft and fraud was a highly profitable consequence from years of deprivation and struggle, and Manuel was making a reasonable living from it. In the spring of 1946, Manuel was apprehended by DC William Munsey when Manuel thought the police had left the home he had broken into on Mount Vernon. Luckily, Munsey had returned to the house and caught him red-handed. It would turn out that Manuel had been sleeping in the attic even while the officers were searching the house. The scene the police found was chaos. Tins opened and contents thrown about the rooms, burn marks and general mess scattered about. Of course, Manuel tried to lie his way out by claiming it was someone else who had committed the crime. At the court, Manuel appeared alongside his father, who was now serving as a local councillor. His father gave the court an assurance that his son would improve his behaviour in the future. Consequently, Manuel was released on bail, thanks to his parents' ability to gather the necessary £60. Before Manuel's release, his father had to provide some details about Manuel's behaviour and potential reasons behind it. According to his father, Manuel had been a well-behaved child until the age of 11, when he was sent to an approved school. His father shared some insight into his life, mentioning that Manuel enjoyed watching films and was skilled at woodwork. He had some friends that were okay and some that were not. He wasn't good with employment, was lazy and couldn't keep a job. It was clear that Manuel's father was disappointed with his son, especially when it came to Peter not attending church, as the family were religious, attending church regularly. When questioned about his medical history, the father mentioned that he hadn't experienced any significant illnesses over the years. However, starting from the age of around 3, he had a tendency to suffer from nosebleeds. As he grew older, during his time in Blackpool, Peter had told him he had had a blackout incident. Whether that was true or not, we don't know. Additionally, he displayed a propensity for violence and appeared to struggle with nervousness. Furthermore, he seemed to require excessive amounts of sleep. His father also stressed that he thought Peter was very intelligent, maybe too intelligent for a boy of his age. Manuel went home with his parents, but also at this time some vicious assaults began, when one woman walking in a quiet area on March the 1st at Mount Vernon was dragged to the floor. Fortunately, she fought back and shouted as loud as she could as the man took off. D.C. Munsey was convinced it was Manuel. He found strands of thick black greased hair, which was one of Manuel's traits. When he went to question him, he wasn't there. He couldn't be found. The next woman to be assaulted was on the 7th of March at Bells Hill. She was a nurse on her way home from work. It was dark and the area was dimly lit, when she was grabbed from behind and her mouth covered by the assailant's hand. She managed to force his hand away slightly and screamed for help. Luckily, some passers-by heard her and ran to help as the assailant took off. She gave a full and accurate description of the assailant, and the description fitted Manuel. The following night, another woman was assaulted while walking home at approximately 9:30 p.m. The attacker blindfolded her before forcefully assaulting and violating her before fleeing. Unfortunately, she was unable to identify her assailant. D.C. Munsey was in no doubt who was responsible. Peter Manuel was brought in and identified as the assailant by the nurse and one of the other ladies. Manuel was charged with the 2 assaults and remanded in custody. While this was ongoing, evidence was being collected. Munsey, determined to see Manuel brought to justice, had as much forensic evidence collected as he possibly could. On June the 26th, 1946, Manuel appeared at Glasgow High Court, where the assault charges were dropped, so they could go forward with rape charge only. Manuel chose to defend himself, and by all accounts he did a reasonably good job, but it took the jury only 15 minutes to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to 8 years. He was also charged with 21 counts of breaking and entering, with 18 of those charges going to court. He was found guilty of 15 and was sentenced to 12 months. He was a troublemaker from the start, causing as many problems as he could, even claiming to one prisoner that he intended to escape. While in HMP Edinburgh, he had asked to be moved back to Barlinnie Prison, where he would be closer to his family, and after all the trouble he had caused, they were happy to grant the transfer. Knowing his family were heartbroken to know their son would be seen as a rapist, he fully and profoundly refused to accept the guilt for this crime. In March 1947, he was moved to Peterhead Prison, a no-nonsense prison. It wasn't just the officers that were tough, the prisoners were some of the worst. Any prisoners inside because of sexual offences were looked down on. It started well for Manuel, and this showed in his letters to his parents, just a normal letter talking about everyday life, such as it was, to inform them of the things that they could send him. As time passed, the letters seemed to show his darker side. He wrote of his hate towards the chief prison officer at Peterhead, Mr. Mackenzie, who would be the one who guided the police towards Manuel when Anne Kneilands' life was taken in 1956. Mackenzie was a no-nonsense man and a strict prison officer. When asked about Manuel years later, he commented that if ever there was a psychopath, he was one. Manuel's communication with his family revealed his emotions towards the prison officer, and at one point he made a comment that could be interpreted as a subtle threat towards Mackenzie's family. However, the letter was not sent because it contained remarks about Mr. Mackenzie and his family. Manuel's short temper quickly led him into trouble. He not only initiated physical altercations and issued threats towards fellow prisoners, but also assaulted a prison guard. Prison records documented Manuel's incessant complaints about various aspects, ranging from the quality of food to the conduct of the guards and the overall conditions. Apart from getting into constant trouble, he spent time studying, took up art and learned languages, and kept fit by the PT class. He also enjoyed films and books about gangsters and studied some law. Charles Tallis, an inmate at Peterhead, became friends with Manuel. He was to play a big part in Manuel's later crimes. Towards the end of his sentence, the prison officials had grown so tired of his constant aggressive behaviour, an appointment was made for him to see a psychiatrist from the Aberdeen Royal Psychiatric Clinic. After speaking with Manuel, he stated he had caused problems for the prison officials because they wouldn't let him learn a trade and didn't care what people thought of him. Manuel objected to this treatment. As far as he was concerned, there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. The doctor wrote in his report, "His record from the age of 12 makes it clear he is an aggressive psychopath. He has had all the benefits of the juvenile court treatment and Borstal treatment, and it is doubtful whether, even at the beginning of his sentence, any constructive work could have been done with him. There is nothing I can suggest now." He also added that he believed he had a higher than average intelligence. The doctor went on to say that he believed there was nothing more he could do. He seemed to be unresponsive to prison reform. He believed he couldn't be changed. And he was right. The enigmatic, intelligent, somewhat handsome Peter Manuel showed many signs of a psychopath. Antisocial behaviour, narcissism, his superficial charm, impulsivity, he was callous and unemotional, showed lack of guilt and lack of empathy. When Manuel was released from prison in October 1952, he returned to live with his family once again, who had now moved to a new house in Birkenshaw. One of the first things he was determined to do was go straight to see Superintendent James Hendry to demand he investigate Murdo Mackenzie, the one man Manuel hated until the very end, claiming Mackenzie had set him up for the crime he was convicted for. In return, he would offer up someone who had allegedly taken the life of 2 women. This person, he claimed, had confided in him while he was confined in Peterhead. From that moment on, he began to suggest to the police other cases they should investigate. He believed he had a strong reputation in the criminal underworld and could be of assistance. Although Hendry did not take Manuel's assertions seriously at first, he still listened attentively to Manuel, who now appeared more articulate and seemingly more intelligent since his incarceration. Hendry dismissed Manuel's claims. Manuel started work as a bin man, but didn't last long and was eventually fired. He then, with his father's help, got a job on the railway. He managed to hold on to this job a little longer than usual, but he would be dismissed after 18 months when it was discovered he'd been stealing from the railway. Once again, according to him, it wasn't his fault. Someone else had committed the crime. He then went to work with his father at the gasworks, doing some labouring work. He had a certain reputation in the gangland hangouts of Glasgow. Walking with a swagger and adopting an American drawl, he made his presence known in the Gorbals pubs. It was said that he possessed a knack for discreetly launching surprise attacks from behind, wielding a cosh skillfully. This ability led to him being sought after as a thug for hire. Something else was always picked up by people. His eyes couldn't look people straight in their eyes. He's always looking around him, his eyes darting side to side. Manuel constantly aspired to enter the realm of the big-time underworld. However, his reputation had suffered due to a significant flaw. He couldn't keep confidential information to himself. Or, as Mad Frankie Fraser put it, he couldn't keep his yap shut. This behaviour did not sit well with the London underground gangs, to whom he had offered his services as a hitman. Consequently, he found himself lacking appreciation and trust within their ranks. In 1953, Samuel Manuel, Peter's father, was arrested as a peeping Tom and had to resign from his position with the council. Whether this had any effect on the family is unsure, but it must have had some sort of effect. Some time later, Manuel, being the pathological liar that he was, went so far as to visit the US consul regarding his US citizenship. While there, he told them he had important information about security. It would seem they took him seriously and flew the man to one of the US bases near London to speak with an FBI agent. It didn't go well. He was interviewed and told to leave. But he didn't stop there. He returned to Scotland and went straight to the police. He encountered Hendry and Munsey. They discussed a gold bullion robbery that he claimed to have been involved in while in London. Despite his story initially sounding believable, further investigation by the police revealed it to be nothing more than a fantasy. Yet another blatant lie from Manuel. The fantasies of this psychopath. Let's take a little look at a couple more. In 1955, he persisted in making delusional calls to the police. At one point, he met up with Detective Bob Kerr at a cafe in Glasgow to discuss the information he claimed to have regarding a bank robbery. The attentive detective let him continue, but when Manuel mentioned that the person involved was a Frenchman named Dante, the detective couldn't help but laugh and left Manuel to pay the bill. Manuel's fantastic stories would continue in all aspects of his life and not just to authority figures. It provided him with a sense of heightened importance, serving as a distraction from the reasons behind his 8-year conviction. By indulging in delusional fantasies, he sought to elevate himself in life and found solace within his own mind. They ranged from preventing a plane crash when the pilot became ill and Manuel came forward to land the plane safely at Glasgow Airport, to taking part in a gunfight when he was asked to help unmask a spy in the United States. He developed a relationship with a bus conductress in 1955, and by all accounts he behaved impeccably towards her. One day she received a letter that told her Manuel wasn't the person she thought he was, and that the Manuels were not his real parents. He was actually the son of an American gangster that had died in the electric chair. When she asked him about it, he claimed to know who'd sent it. It was more than likely himself, as it was all BS. They were going to get engaged, but Manuel's mother made it clear that he should tell her and her parents about his past. Needless to say, the engagement was called off. Whether it was because of his past isn't known. He became well known for his stories, not just with his family and workmates, but also with the police, who had grown used to his claims and his fantasies. But something more sinister was about to unfold. A crime had been committed, leaving no doubt that Manuel was responsible for a terrifying attack. The victim could easily identify him, and there was an abundance of evidence to support the accusation. Remarkably, Peter Manuel chose to defend himself and skillfully manoeuvred his way out of a guilty verdict. Mary McLaughlin had been to a dance on the 30th of July 1955 and was walking home at around 11:30 p.m. As she walked down a lane, she was suddenly attacked from behind and thrown to the floor. She noticed the man had a knife that he held to her throat. Putting his hand over her mouth, he forced her into a field. At one point she managed to scream, which prompted him to repeat his threat of harm. Her scream was actually heard by a couple of policemen who looked around to see where it had come from, but could find nothing, so they left. While the search was ongoing, Manuel had forced her over some fields and made her lay down and stay quiet until the search was over. What this woman went through was horrific. He threatened to cut her head off before forcing kisses on her and used his hands to touch her. She cried and managed through her tears to convince him she had children and to please not take her life. He then suddenly stopped. It was later thought that his need for gratification could have actually been reached, and that would be the reason he stopped. And now calm Manuel sat side by side with a shaking Mary. He told her he was drunk as he was meant to be married, but it had fallen through, and gave her some other information. He then strangely offered to take her to the police station, as he knew she would go to them. She declined his offer, telling him she wanted to go home. He then walked with her. He lit a cigarette, and she now saw him clearly, and recognised him as someone she saw on the bus on her way to work in the mornings. When they got to the place she said she lived, he left. A few hours later she went straight to the police. Inspector Munsey was on the case. He knew Peter Manuel very well. A plain-clothed police officer was placed on the morning bus, and Mary pointed out Samuel Manuel as the man her attacker was usually with. They arrested Manuel and collected a lot of evidence from his home, including clothing stained with blood. They found a knife and took samples of soil and vegetation they hoped would match samples from Manuel's clothing. He was charged and remanded to Barlini. Before his trial began, he was examined by Dr. Anderson, the chief medical officer at Barlini, reported his findings to the Procurator Fiscal. It read, "He is properly oriented and he is not feeble-minded. His conversation is quite intelligent and he discussed himself and his activities quite freely. His sister told me that she believed him to suffer from delusions of persecution and feels that the world is against him. I can find no confirmation of this, as he does not appear to me to suffer from hallucinations or delusions. By his own account, he is happy in his present employment as a gas board labourer, and his relationships with his family, workmates and friends are satisfactory. He appears to me to understand the nature of his charge and to understand the gravity of his position. As a result of my examination, I can elicit no evidence to suggest that this man is insane. I am of the opinion that he is, at present, sane and fit to plead." Manuel underwent multiple examinations, each time yielding the same medical results. On October the 17th at Airdrie Sheriff Court, Manuel went to trial, making the decision to defend himself. The police considered the case against Manuel to be straightforward, believing it would result in his imprisonment. Their confidence grew stronger when they discovered that Manuel's alibi, that he had been with a woman on that night, which would prove his innocence, was proven false. It turned out that he'd been with the woman during the week prior to the crime, not at the time of the incident. Taking the decision to defend himself gave him more freedom where the law was concerned. He didn't have to swear to tell the truth, and he didn't have to go into the witness box and couldn't be cross-examined. Manuel put his case forward, giving his own variation on what had happened that night, as well as putting his mother in the witness box as a character witness. Manuel's statement. For some time, Mary McLaughlin and he had been courting, but they had quarrelled. He had met her around midday on the day she claimed he had assaulted her. They had words, and he struck her and cut her lip. Then they made up and went together into a field where he had set snares for rabbits. She had torn her leg on some barbed wire, hence the blood on his trousers. He had lost his knife when throwing it at a dog that was in danger of being struck by a train on the nearby railway line. He had been unable to find and retrieve it. Her story was untrue, motivated by resentment and hatred. Manuel's demeanour and presentation in court showcased his intelligence and legal knowledge acquired throughout the years. The jury struggled with a decision and eventually brought in a verdict of case not proven. Mary McLaughlin had to suffer indignities for a long time after. People turned their backs on her, and at one point Manuel saw her at the local bus stop and spat at her. Manuel revelled in his success at court, but he knew he wouldn't make the same mistake again by leaving his victims alive. In 1956, Manuel and his father were working as labourers for the gas board. Their job involved laying pipelines for the newly constructed homes in Calderwood, East Kilbride. January the 4th, George Gribbons discovered Anne Kneilands' body just a short distance from where the labourers were working. On the 11th of January, Miss Anne Steele was found deceased in her flat in Glasgow. On the 15th of June 1956, street worker Ellen Petrie was found deceased from knife wounds behind a building. A description of a man walking away from the area matched Manuel. On the 12th of September, Mr. and Mrs. Platt and their son returned home to find their home had been broken into. The pattern of behaviour fitted other break-ins Manuel had committed, but no fingerprints were found and no witnesses. On the 17th of September, the bodies of Mrs. Watt, her sister and daughter, were found in their home, all deceased. Around the 17th, a house just doors away from the Watts house, belonging to the Martin sisters, was reported to have been broken into. On Tuesday morning, the 18th of September, at around 4:30 a.m, the police called at the Manuel's house to search the property, with an angry Samuel protesting in their ears. They couldn't find anything to incriminate Manuel, but they would return to search again. While the investigation moved forward with the Watt deaths, Mr. Watt had become a suspect when D.S. Mitchell, who had driven Mr. Watt back to Glasgow, mentioned that Mr. Watt didn't seem to show any emotion and didn't show any signs of shock. They held an ID parade where two witnesses picked out Mr. Watt as the man they'd seen driving south towards Glasgow on the night of the murders. One being a motorist who was driving north alongside Loch Lomond when he noticed a car had stopped. The witness saw the man he thought was Watt when he lit a cigarette up. The other, a ferryman on the Renfrew ferry, a route that had been taken by anyone heading towards Burnside. He claimed he saw Watt, his car and his dog. Watt was a broken man, and on the 27th of September, 2 days after the funeral of his wife, daughter and sister-in-law, he was arrested and taken to Barlinnie prison. Investigations continued into Mr. Watt, and William lawyered up, hiring the best criminal lawyer in Glasgow, Lawrence Dowdall. In the meantime, the police began their search for any evidence linking William Watt to the crime. Their objective was to determine whether it was possible for him to make the journey from the hotel to his home, commit the crime and return to the hotel without being noticed. D.S. Mitchell and P.C. Copland successfully completed the trip south in a little over 2 hours. We now have to jump back to March 1956, when Manuel and another man broke into a canteen of a colliery. They stole a large amount of cigarettes and a small amount of money, but the police had been tipped off and were waiting. One man was caught, but Manuel managed to get away, ripping his clothing while escaping. It resulted in his arrest, but he was given bail. In July, he and a man called Joe Brannan were reported to police when they were seen acting suspiciously near a home. When the police arrived, the two men jumped from a high wall. Brannan broke his leg, but Manuel fled. Brannan kept quiet about Manuel and never gave him up. He had earned Manuel's trust. Moving forward again to October 1956, at his trial for the colliery break-in, he once again defended himself and once again used his mother as a character witness. But he also talked ex-convict Charles Tallis into being a witness. But Tallis backed out and Manuel had to withdraw his special defence. Manuel was sentenced to 18 months. Manuel was doing his 18 months in Barlinnie prison at the same time Watt was there. He then went on to do something odd. He decided to contact Lawrence Dowdall and asked him to represent him for his appeal and to get him out on bail. He claimed to have information that could help a recent client of Mr. Dowdall's. When Dowdall visited him regarding the appeal, Manuel gave him the information he'd promised. He told him it was about the Watt murders, claiming to know who'd actually done the job, and it wasn't Watt. Dowdall, in his pursuit for more information, further questioned Manuel. Manuel then revealed that he had been invited to participate in a break-in at Burnside by a man who showed him a revolver. However, Manuel refused to join him. Despite his refusal, the break-in and subsequent murder still occurred. Later on, the man approached Manuel and requested him to dispose of the revolver. To further his story, he drew a picture of the gun. He continued. The man had, according to Manuel, broke into 2 houses that night, one in Fensbank Avenue. In the other house he had shot 2 women and struck a young woman over the head when she tried to run. He had dragged the young woman back to her room and knocked her out. He then, according to Manuel, ransacked the place, but noticed the girl was conscious again and shot her. According to Manuel, the man stole 2 rings from the house on Fensbank Avenue and gave them to Manuel, who went on to give Dowdall a full description of the rings. Knowing Manuel's history of storytelling, Dowdall expressed his scepticism. In response, Manuel fired back with a detailed description of the Watt house, going room by room. Dowdall went straight to see Hendry, asking if he could look inside the Watt house. They allowed him in to visit, and he noticed how accurate Manuel's description was. Returning to Barlinnie prison to see Manuel, he wanted to know more. Maybe he'd seen the newspapers where they had drawn up plans. Knowing now that Manuel didn't like to be seen as wrong, Manuel went on to give a precise description of how one of the women was shot twice and gave him the exact locations of where they were shot. Dowdall hadn't heard this himself, so he asked the police about what he'd heard. The information he received was exactly how Manuel had described it. On his next visit, he told Manuel that he doubted, after all he had told him, that someone who knew so much wasn't in the home when this happened. Manuel obviously denied it, but still wanted Dowdall to get him out on bail and offered to retrieve the gun that he'd thrown into the Clyde. Dowdall told Manuel to give all these details to the police, but obviously he refused. While Dowdall was preparing for trial, he received a letter from Manuel that appeared to be a veiled threat. Whatever Dowdall's thoughts were at the time, it's uncertain. Nonetheless, he requested bail for Manuel, which was denied. Things were starting to move forward, and the police, in particular Henry, visited Manuel at the prison for questioning on a couple of occasions. Was there now some doubt about Mr. Watt being responsible for the deaths? The Glasgow Procurator Fiscal also visited Manuel. Dowdall had some ideas he put forward to his client, Mr. Watt. On his visit, he told Watt about what Manuel had told him and advised him to ask around the other prisoners to see what they knew of the man. Next, he decided to pay a visit to Chief Inspector Bob Kerr, an acquaintance who had previously worked on the Watt case. Dowdall wasted no time in sharing all the information he had gathered from Manuel. Acting promptly, Kerr immediately contacted the Lanarkshire police, resulting in the revelation that they were now excavating Manuel's garden on the 22nd of November, but nothing could be found. The newspapers were watching and waiting for more information, letting people know what they could find out. Some information released was along the right lines, but others not so much, which is often the case as we all ponder and theorise over cases. A furious Manuel threw a huge tantrum when he was told of what had happened at his family's home. Writing a letter to the Crown Office, he complained bitterly about the way Henry had carried out the whole situation. He also mentioned that his parents had reported to him that Superintendent Henry was accusing him of having taken the life of Anne Kneilands and was possibly involved in the Watt case, of which he denied outright. The police, it would seem, were split in their beliefs. Some believing Manuel could be responsible, others not so sure, and stuck with the belief Watt was responsible. Munsey was convinced it was Manuel. Henry not so much. However, even though the case was under the jurisdiction of the Lanarkshire police, there was a shift occurring. The authorities in Glasgow were expressing interest in the information they were receiving. Reports were being sent to the Procurator Fiscal, informing him about what Dowdall had been told by Manuel. Kerr had then passed this information on to Henry, who, like Kerr, thought it may just be another of Manuel's lies. The clock was ticking, but a frustrated police force had very little on the 4 high-profile murders. Dowdall conducted his own investigation regarding Watt, retracing the exact journey the police had taken. To his surprise, he discovered that the time frame stated by the police was impossible to achieve. In addition, he inquired about Watt's car at the hotel. Given the freezing cold conditions on the night of the murders, Dowdall observed that Watt's car would still be covered in frost the following morning, and apparently it was. William Watt was released on the 3rd of December after 67 days in prison, when the court decided there was not enough evidence against him. But the same could be said of Manuel. There was nothing to tie him to the Watt case. Mr. Watt's life was difficult on returning home, as many people were still unsure of his innocence. He had lost all faith in the Lanarkshire police, so as a former rail policeman and helped during the war, he took it upon himself to try and investigate himself. While in prison, he had managed to pick up some information on Manuel's movements and hangouts. He decided to delve into the underground bars and soon became quite popular with some of the clientele. There were also some of the people he had known for some years through his business. As he asked around, someone mentioned 2 rings Manuel had shown to an associate that he had acquired from Burnside, the Martins' house. The associate was Charles Tallis. As time went on, he came across an increasing number of stories about Manuel. Informants provided him with ample material to investigate. As time passed, Kerr, a man feared among the criminal world, had grown to believe that Watt was possibly innocent. In January 1957, Watt spoke with Kerr for hours, and by the end of the meeting he had come to the conclusion that Watt was completely innocent. Kerr reported back to the Procurator Fiscal, telling him about the conversation and that Watt believed that Manuel and possibly Charles Tallis were involved in the murders. He told of Watt's mistrust of the Lanarkshire police, but in his view he believed Watt was telling the truth, and, he added, he was convinced Peter Manuel had killed Anne Kneilands. Kerr was careful and went on to tell the Procurator that he was deeply concerned that the police had made a grave error with Mr. Watt, and they must be vigilant not to repeat the same mistake with Manuel. Although Manuel was now considered a killer by a major police officer, it wasn't so cut and dry for Hendry. Kerr went with Watt to see Hendry, but the meeting didn't go so well. He was given all the evidence against Manuel, but he still claimed, in his own words, "You can forget about Manuel. If anyone knows Manuel, I do. If anyone knows how Manuel thinks, it's me." Despite the mounting evidence being produced, Hendry didn't want to see his arrest of Watt being seen as wrong, even if others in the force could see the connection. November 1957, as Manuel's sentence was close to ending, Mr. Watt, who was still gathering his own evidence, heard that Manuel had claimed he had something on Watt that would be his meal ticket when released. And then a rather cryptic letter from Manuel arrived at Dowdall's office. It read, once he had told him of his release date of Saturday, November the 30th, "I would like you to phone my house on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. sharp." This was so they could set up a meeting between he and Dowdall. He went on, "The subject of the meeting you can put down to unfinished business concerning a party who was, to my knowledge, doubly unfortunate." Dowdall arranged to meet with Manuel on Monday the 2nd of December. Apparently Manuel repeated what he had already told him in prison and wanted to clear up the Watt case. He then went on to show Dowdall a black and white photo of a young woman who he claimed to be Vivian Watt. Manuel wanted Dowdall to arrange a meeting with Watt, and that meeting did indeed go ahead, sometime early in December. There are differing accounts of the meeting, but the main version comes from what was said at court. Watt wanted answers to his family's murders, and Manuel wanted money for information. Watt made it clear he would not give Manuel any money. Watt stated that Manuel had told him many things and knew a lot about the murders. Watt said, "Manuel told me many things and also answered many questions. His attitude was that he knew all about the murders. Manuel told him that 3 people, Charles Tallis, Martin Hart and Mrs. Mary Bowes, had gone housebreaking in Burnside. They robbed a house several doors away from the Watts and then went looking for the Valentes house. They believed that the Valentes kept between £5,000 and £10,000 in a safe in their house. They had spotted the Valenti daughter in the Watt house and concluded that that was where she lived. They went away but came back later to rob what they assumed was the Valente house. Their plan was to shoot all the people there except for one, whom they would force to tell them where the safe was kept. Thus, Manuel claimed, the Watt house had been raided in error. After the shooting, he claimed Hart and Bowers ran when they heard the shots and Tallis shot Vivian. The family mentioned were neighbours of the Watts, and the young woman was good friends with Vivian and had spent time with her that day. The gun that was used was one Manuel had given to Tallis, according to Manuel. Manuel went on to claim that Tallis had given him back the gun and, in a state of distress, told him what had happened. Watt asked Manuel to describe the house in greater detail. Manuel provided him with an abundance of information, insisting that it had all come from Tallis. Additionally, Manuel claimed that he was responsible for securing Watt's release from prison due to a secret piece of information he possessed. When Watt expressed his scepticism that Tallis would cooperate with the police, Manuel responded coolly, "Well, there's always the possibility that Tallis might choose to end his own life by using the very same gun that took the lives of the Watts family, and the gun would be found next to his body." A shocked Watt took it to mean that Manuel would take the life of Tallis if he had to. He then went on to claim he had dropped the gun in the Clyde, but in a way he could retrieve it if he needed to. Manuel then showed the photo he had of the young woman and asked Watt if it was his daughter, to which Watt replied, "No. Whatever happened in the entire day they were together, we can only go by Watt's statement in court." Watt took all the contents of the conversation between him and Manuel to Dowdall. Another meeting was arranged among the three, which took place at the same location. During this meeting, Manuel retold the same story to Dowdall. The information was passed on to the police by Dowdall, but when they went to talk to Manuel, he had gone and couldn't be found at his usual hangouts. From early December 1957, the Lanarkshire police had persuaded Joe Brannan to stay close to Manuel and report back to them. On Saturday the 28th of December, 17-year-old Isabel Cook was on her way to meet her boyfriend, Douglas Bryden, at the bus stop, as they were going to a dance that evening. Her boyfriend waited, but Isabel didn't arrive. In the early hours, her parents were frantic with worry. They had been searching for her for hours, but they couldn't find her. After contacting the police, a search was started, and the devastated parents were later shown some items that they identified as Isabel's, but no sign of Isabel. On New Year's Eve, Peter Smart was planning on taking his wife and son to his parents at Ancram for a family gathering. He had just been paid and went to the bank to pay it in. He then withdrew £35 of crisp new notes before returning to the firm he worked for, J.W. Watson Building Contractors, to pay back some money he owed. He brought some alcohol to bring in the new year with and had a few drinks at the pub before going to his Sheepburn Road home. Manuel also went for drinks on the 31st. He went with his brother and father, who paid for the drinks. Eventually Joe Brannan joined them, and it became quite apparent to him that Manuel was broke, as he witnessed Samuel giving his son some money to pay for drinks. They returned home to enjoy a family gathering of their own that lasted until around 4 a.m, when they all allegedly went to bed. At 5 a.m. on New Year's Day, a taxi driver spotted an Austin A30 driving erratic and at speed with no lights on a cold and dark winter morning down Sheepburn Drive. It was spotted again a little later by a woman who noticed it because it was parked up in a firm's car park, and as it was New Year's Day, the car park would usually be empty. More importantly, it was only a few minutes away from the Manuel's home. Manuel rose early and purchased cigarettes before arriving at Joe Brannan's house. The significant difference that caught Brannan's attention was the fact that Manuel now possessed cash. It was quite a substantial amount, as Brannan observed when they gathered at the neighbourhood pub with Peter Manuel, his brother James, and Brannan himself. Brannan was taken aback by Peter's ostentatious display of wealth, particularly when he offered to cover the cost of their drinks. When asked by Brannan where he'd got the cash, Manuel replied at the Gordon Club. Someone owed him a payment regarding the Watt case. Later, at a party for a family member, he collected some bottles of alcohol and mentioned to Brannan that he had driven an A30 to and from where they were celebrating to get the bottles from the Wood End Hotel. The next day he gave a policeman who was on his way to search for Isabel Cook a lift in the A30. On January the 2nd, the Smarts' house appeared cold and silent. It was observed that while the curtains to the right of the front door were open, those on the left remained closed. Additionally, the garage doors had been opened and the car was missing. Later that day, a bin man took note that all the front curtains were now closed. However, by January the 3rd, all the curtains had been reopened, but later closed again, and a light had been turned on, giving the impression someone had been in and out of the house. Manuel and Brannan went drinking, but in the early hours of Saturday morning, the 4th of January, just a short distance away from Sheepburn Road, Mr. and Mrs. McMunn woke to see someone at their bedroom door. Mr. McMunn shouted out to the figure, who didn't respond, then called to his wife to get his gun, to which the person fled down the stairs and out the house. Mr. Smart was due back at work on the 6th of January. When he failed to show up, worried co-workers tried to get in touch with him. 2 of Mr. Smart's co-workers contacted the police and went with the officer to the home. Looking around, they saw no signs of a break-in, and the place was locked up. The officer made his way to the back door and used force to open it. As soon as they stepped inside, a scene of absolute horror unfolded before their eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Smart lay lifeless in their beds, both having suffered fatal gunshot wounds to the head. Tragically, their 11-year-old son Michael also lay in his bed with a bullet wound in his head. Over the next few days, the police extensively searched the garden and its surroundings for any clues, but their efforts yielded little results. Their primary focus was on locating the murder weapon, believed to be an Italian-style automatic Beretta pistol. On the 11th of January, Brannan had called on Manuel, who had clearly been in a fight. His nose was swollen and he had a bruised eye. When asked what had happened, he told Brannan that Danny McKay had laid into him when Manuel had tried to extort money from him by claiming to inform the police McKay had some involvement with the Smart deaths. Meanwhile, the police investigation into the deaths of the Smarts continued. Soon enough, they made a breakthrough. The crisp new notes that Peter Smart had withdrawn the day before turned out to be sequential banknotes. This crucial information allowed the police to identify the precise serial numbers that would appear on these notes. At 6:45 a.m. on the 14th of January 1958, homicide detectives that included D.S. Alex Brown, D.I. Tom Goodall, Chief Inspector William Munsey, Detective Inspector Robert McNeil, Inspector Scott, D.S. Scott, and a policewoman sergeant and 2 other officers arrived at the Manuel's home. Only 2 officers, D.S. Brown and D.I. Goodall, were to speak with the Manuels, the others under strict instructions not to communicate with any of the household, making sure the family couldn't instigate arguments. According to the police statements that were produced in court, the scene went something like this. D.S. Brown stopped Samuel Manuel at his gate. He produced the warrant and proceeded to enter the property. Samuel, his wife, and James Manuel were all hostile, and Samuel demanded to read the warrant. Peter Manuel was asleep downstairs and woke up when the officers entered. They made it clear that they were there to find evidence related to the Smart murders. Peter Manuel went into a rage as the officers searched. D.S. Brown told Manuel to get dressed as he was being taken to the police station for an identity parade. As he was being taken away, he screamed at his parents to get Jimmy Bell, a reporter, and to call Dowdall. Upstairs they found a pair of men's gloves, and Munsey came across a camera. When Samuel was asked who these items belonged to, he said they were his. This would land him into trouble, as the items were identified as stolen goods. He was charged for theft and taken to the station. A number of items were taken away. and the vast majority of Peter Manuel's clothes, plus the all-important banknotes that would be found to match the serial numbers of those Peter Smart had withdrawn. At Hamilton Police Headquarters, Manuel was questioned by Brown, McNeil and Goodall, who informed him that his father was being held at Bellshill Station after being charged with theft. At this, Manuel went into a full-blown meltdown. Once he had calmed down, Brown reminded him that this was a murder investigation. Manuel then claimed it was Dandy McKay who had given him the banknotes. McKay was brought in and the two men faced each other. When hearing what Manuel had to say, McKay raged that it was untrue and Manuel would swing for this. At the identity parade, Manuel was ID'd by the witnesses as the man who had used the new pound notes and by those who saw a man on the railway lines when Miss Cook was killed. It would also seem that the Glasgow Underground had had enough of Manuel, and Mackay gave them information as to where Manuel had come into possession of the Beretta in December. Later that evening, Manuel was charged with the Reverend Houston break-in and the Smart murders. He had nothing to say and was placed in a cell. The next morning he was taken to court, where he was remanded in custody for 4 days, then taken back to the station, where the officers were instructed not to talk to him at all. Later, at around 12 p.m, Manuel requested to talk with McNeil. When no one came, he requested once again to speak with him at about 2:50 p.m. McNeil and D.S. Goodall spoke with him under caution. Manuel went on to claim that he could help them with some unsolved murders in Lanarkshire. At this, McNeil advised Manuel to get a solicitor. Manuel requested his mother to get in touch with Dowdall. When she did, he refused, knowing he may be called as a witness. With Manuel's huge ego, he decided to go ahead without a solicitor. He then asked McNeil about his dad's charges. He then went on to say, "Bring my parents here and I will talk to them in your presence, and after I have spoken with them and made a clean breast of things, you can take them away and I will clear everything up for you, and I will take you to where the girl Cook is buried." On January the 15th, Manuel was handed pen and paper where he wrote, "To Detective Inspector McNeil, I hereby freely and voluntarily give the following promise. I will lead information about the following specified crimes. 1. Anne Kneilands. 2. The Watt murders. 3. Isabel Cook. 4. The Smart murders. On condition that my father is released and allowed to see me with my mother. The information I refer to concerns me, Peter Thomas Manuel, and my part in the above-mentioned crimes. I will give complete and concise information on these crimes that will clear them up completely. Signed, Peter Manuel." This being the second written confession, as Manuel claimed the first one, when read back to him, wasn't good enough. After being told by McNeil that this might not suffice and that it was not within their control whether his father would be released, but rather the Procurator Fiscal's decision, Manuel, according to McNeil, made a verbal confession while under caution, and gave them an explicit explanation of what had happened to the Smart family. On hearing this, the Procurator Fiscal gave permission for Peter Manuel's parents to see him. At this meeting, Manuel sat surrounded by officers as he began to explain to his parents what he had done. He went on to tell them he had killed the girl Kneilands at East Kilbride and then shot the 3 women at Burnside and then the young girl Isabel Cook, and he was going to take the police to where she was buried. Finally, he told of the Smart killings. Manuel then took the police on quite the journey in pitch darkness. They stumbled through fields, through ditches and hedges, until Manuel pointed to what looked like a shallow hole. He stated he had begun to dig there when he was disturbed by a man walking by. He said he took her further away, and eventually they came to a pile of bricks where a woman's shoe was found, then another. He then dragged them through farmland close to the brickyard. Once he got his bearings from a tree, he counted paces as he walked forward in a recently ploughed field. He then pointed to a spot, claiming, "I think she's there." They dug the earth and found Isabel Cook's body. Manuel was taken back to the station, where he made a statement at 4:15 a.m. to Inspector Matthew Cleland. "I hereby confess that on the first day of January 1956, I was the person responsible for killing Anne Kneilands. On the 17th of September 1956, I was responsible for killing Mrs. Marion Watt and her sister, Mrs. George Brown, also her daughter Vivian. On the 28th of December 1957, I was responsible for killing Isabel Cook. On January the 1st, 1958, I was responsible for killing Mr. Peter Smart, his wife Doris, and their son. I freely admit and acknowledge my guilt in the above-mentioned crimes, and wish to write a statement concerning them. On the 1st of January 1956, I was in East Kilbride at about 7 p.m. in the evening. At about 7:30 p.m, I was walking towards the cross when I met a girl. She spoke to me and addressed me as Tommy. I told her my name was not Tommy, and she said she thought she knew me. We got talking, and she told me she had to meet someone, but she did not think they were turning up for the meeting. After a while, I asked her if she would like some tea or coffee. She assented, and we went into the Willow Cafe. I do not remember how long we were there, but it was not long. When we came out, she said she was going home, and I offered to see her home. She then said she lived miles away, and that I would probably get lost if I took her home. I insisted, and she said, all right. We walked along the road up to the Maxwellton Road. From there we went along a curving road that I cannot name. About halfway along this road, I pulled her into a field gate. She struggled and ran away, and I chased her across a field and over a ditch. When I caught up to her, I dragged her into a wood. In the woods, she started screaming, and I hit her over the head with a piece of iron I'd picked up. After I'd killed her, I ran down a country lane that brought me out at the General's Bridge at the East Kilbride Road. I do not know where I flung the piece of iron. I then ran down to Highway Ballantrae and along a road that brought me to Bardykes Road. I went along Bardykes Road and over the railway to where I live. I got home about 10:15 p.m. I went up to East Kilbride from Hamilton about 6:30 p.m. in the evening. On the 16th of September 1956, I left the Wood End Hotel, Moss End, at 10 p.m. in the evening. I took 2 women into Glasgow. One I dropped from a taxi at 283 High Street. The other one I took to Merchiston Street in North Carntine. I left her there and took the taxi to Parkhead Cross. At the cross, I caught the bus to Birkenshaw. When I arrived home, I met a man I knew, and he took me in a car up to Burnside. He had another man and a woman with him. We broke into a house in Fensbank Avenue, number 18. We were there some time and somebody went to bed. I do not remember much about this house. The car was left in a lane in a small wooded area bordering the East Kilbride Road. After a while I went scouting about looking at other houses. I found a house that looked empty and went back to number 18. Somebody had brought the car around and put it in beside the house in front of the garage. I told them, and they drove me up and got out at the other house. The others did not like the look of it, so they went back to the other house, number 18. I broke into the house by breaking the front door panel, which was made of glass. I then went in and opened the bedroom door.
There were 2 people in the bed. I went into the other room and there was a girl in the bed. She woke up and sat up. I hit her on the chin and knocked her out. I tied her hands and went back to the other room. I shot the 2 people in this room and then heard someone making a noise in the other room. I went back in and the girl had got loose. We struggled around for a while and then I flung her on the bed and shot her too. I then went back to number 18 and found them all asleep. We then took the car and they dropped me at Birkenshaw and they went on to Motherwell at about 5 a.m. on the 17th of September. I did not steal anything from the house at number 5 Fensbank Avenue. That same day I went into Glasgow and flung the gun in the Clyde at the suspension bridge. I got the gun in a public house in Glasgow called the Mercat Bar, which is at Glasgow Cross. I do not remember the date I got the gun. I got the gun as one of a pair I bought. The man who fixed it for me told me the 2 men who came into the pub were policemen. The other gun was taken by a man from Burnbank. I never found out what became of it. On the 28th of December 1957 I went to Mount Vernon about 7 p.m. going by bus from Birkenshaw to Mount Vernon. I walked up a road leading to the railway bridge that runs from Bothwell to Shettleston. Just over the bridge I met a girl walking. I grabbed her and dragged her into a field on the same side as Rylands Riding School. I took her along a field following the line in the Bothwell direction. I took her handbag and filled it with stones from the railway. Before going any further I flung it in a pond in the middle of a field. I then made her go with me alongside the dog track. When we got near the dog track she started to scream. I tore off her clothes and tied something around her neck and choked her. I then carried her up a lane into a field and dug a hole with a shovel. While I was digging, a man passed along the lane on a bike, so I carried her again over a path beside a brickwork into another field. I dug a hole next to a part of the field that was ploughed and put her in it. I covered her up and went back the same way I came. I went back up the road and got her shoes which had come off. I took these and her clothes and scattered them about. The clothes I flung in the River Calder at Broomhouse. The shoe I hid on the railway bank at the dog track. I went up the same path and came out at Bailston. I walked along the Edinburgh Road and up Aikenhead Road to Birkenshaw, getting there about 12:30 a.m. On the morning of the 1st of January, I left my home about 5:30 a.m. I went down a park path to the foot of Lucy Brae. Crossing the road, I went into Sheepburn Road and broke into a bungalow. I went through the house and took a quantity of banknotes from a wallet I found in a jacket in the front bedroom. There was about £20 to £25 in the wallet. I then shot the man in the bed and next the woman. I went into the next room and shot the boy. I did not take anything from the house except money. I got the gun from a man in a Glasgow club, the Gordon Club. I took a car from the garage and drove it up the car park at Ranco Works. Later that day, I took the gun into Glasgow and threw it in the Clyde at Glasgow Green. The next day, Thursday the 2nd, I saw the car was still in a car park, so drove it to Glasgow about 8 o'clock in the morning and left it in Florence Street in the south side. Then I caught a bus back home. I got into the house through a window and left by the back door. Signed, Peter Manuel. Now it was a full-on investigation into collecting as much physical evidence they could. Manuel took them to all the spots to retrieve vital evidence, such as the iron bar, the guns from the Clyde, and Smart's keys. All the gathered evidence was sent for forensic tests. As the evidence collected grew, so did the charges. On January the 29th, 1958, Peter Manuel was arrested for Sidney Dunn's murder, because it was discovered that on the 8th of December at the village of Edmund Byers, close to Newcastle, taxi driver Sidney Dunn was found on the moors with a bullet in his head and his throat cut. His damaged taxi parked a little further away. He hadn't been robbed. Because this had happened in England, he would be tried for that crime after the Scottish trial. On the 15th of February, Peter Manuel was charged with 9 murders, 8 in Scotland and Duns in England. Preparing for the trial was demanding for the defence team, who consisted of John Ferns, Ian Doherty and leading counsel Harold Leslie. Manuel, brimming with arrogance, believed he possessed the superior knowledge compared to his defence. He stubbornly insisted on doing things according to his own whims, all the while hoping to protect himself. A powerful belief in his persuasive abilities fueled his mindset, as it had proven successful in the past. This was evidenced when his lawyers advised him to plead guilty to the Mary McLaughlin attack, a suggestion he vehemently rejected. Once again, while in Barlinnie, he began to cause problems, complaining about whatever he could, and went on a 2-day hunger strike because he had heard that he couldn't discuss with visitors why he had been arrested. The ban was lifted, which led to some witnesses for the defence possibly committing perjury at the trial. Manuel wrote to reporters, one in particular, and also to his mother, who threw them in the fire without reading them, claiming they were tainted. The next obstacle for both sides was to determine whether Peter Manuel was mentally ill. Was he fit for trial? Manuel underwent medical psychiatric evaluations that he hated with a passion, which was strange as he enjoyed talking about himself a lot and gave those examining him a good picture of who he was. He would undergo 6 examinations by various doctors. It would later come to light that his own family had doubts about his mental state. But before the trial, when one of the doctors, Dr. McNiven, spoke with the family, they insisted there was no sign of mental illness in the family, and they saw no signs of it in their son, describing him as kind and gentle and would give anyone the shirt off his back. But his sister Teresa, who was a qualified mental nurse, had her own thoughts about her brother and had claimed she knew he was a psychopath. He had attacked her when she was younger with a bread knife. When McNiven spoke with Manuel, Manuel insisted there was nothing wrong with him and it was all a conspiracy by the police because of the McLaughlin case. McNiven concluded that Manuel saw himself as a master criminal engaged in a struggle with the police. McNiven's final conclusion was that although Manuel showed signs of psychopathy, he didn't have all the traits, but he did show signs of being remarkably detached from certain situations. But all in all, he found him sane and fit for trial, as did the other doctors that examined him, most concluding that Manuel was relaxed and detached from what he was being charged with. All was ready and the trial at Glasgow High Court began on the 12th of May 1958 in front of Judge Lord Cameron. Advocate Deputy Gordon Gillis was to lead on behalf of the Crown, supported by Ranald Sutherland. Grieve and Morrison for the defence, led by QC Harold Leslie. The crowds gathered outside as Manuel was driven into court. It wasn't going to be a smooth run. Well, of course it wouldn't be. Manuel's ego wasn't going to allow that. The trial moved forward with both sides doing extremely well. The witnesses did their part and some questionable answers were given by some that would eventually lead them into being fined for perjury on the defence side. William Watt appeared on a stretcher with doctors alongside as he had just been involved in a car accident and his injuries meant that he couldn't stand for some time. Some of the most famous Glasgow underground names also appeared, most of them for the Crown. Professor Allison and Dr. Imrie presented their medical evidence in court. Professor Allison was the first to share his findings, and the jury attentively listened as he described the horrifying scenes and injuries. At one point, Leslie reluctantly put forward a theory of Manuel's that maybe the victims of gunshots could be down to taking their own lives. Allison gave his response that usually when someone takes their own life by using a gun, the gun is dropped by that person, and there were 6 victims and no gun. Dr. Imrie reinforced what Professor Allison had already stated. When McNeil gave evidence, the defence attacked the legitimacy of the signed confessions, asking them to be excluded, stating that any statements that were made by the accused man cannot be said to have been given voluntarily or spontaneously. He claimed that by taking the accused father into custody was to put pressure on his son by high-ranking officers, making Manuel's first statement suspect and any other following. He asked his lordship to investigate the circumstances behind how the statements were obtained. Cameron agrees to discuss the situation and dismisses the jury while they do. The matter was discussed with McNeil, who told them exactly what had happened. Once again, that Manuel hadn't asked for legal advice and had asked for McNeil to be present when speaking with his parents. He went over all the questions that Leslie put to him and corrected Leslie when he slipped up on some questions. Goodall and Brown followed. It was made very clear by all the officers that Manuel was offered as well as advised to get legal advice on more than one occasion, and the statements were made voluntarily by Manuel. Manuel claimed that the police had lied. He had been pressured into the statements, claiming they threatened to arrest his father and even his sister at one point. In fact, Manuel leaned heavily into how and why the confessions were, in his opinion, coerced from him. He claimed the police had threatened to crucify his family and pin the murders on him. Lord Cameron, after questioning Leslie on some subjects, decided, "Having seen and heard the witnesses, I have no doubt in preferring the denials of the police officers to the assertions of the accused. I have come to the conclusion that no ground has been established for excluding the statements." The jury were brought back in and the trial continued. McNeil, back in the witness box, read out the signed statements Manuel made. By the 10th day, the court had heard some horrifying and sickening revelations. Manuel was about to put a spanner in the works. In the absence of the jury, Manuel conferred with his counsel. Leslie then told the judge that he and his colleagues were no longer able to continue as Mr. Manuel had decided to conduct his own defence. According to the reporters that ran to the court entrance in order to take photos of them leaving, they seemed happy and relieved to be leaving. When it was Manuel's turn to speak, he apparently did well. There were some odd questions, but all in all he did well according to court records. In his attempts to discredit the statements, he accused the police of forging his signature. He grilled the police regarding the victims and hoped the jury would start to doubt what had already been put out. Read the statements. All the police officers gave evidence regarding how the confessions were written, how items belonging to Cook were found, and how they had followed McNeil and Goodall as Manuel led them to the place she was found, and how they attended her post-mortem. On the 11th day, the prosecution continued to add more details to the case. On the subject of how the Smarts were killed, D.S. Souter, the firearms expert, was questioned by Manuel, who asked him if he had ruled out suicide. He had, through the lack of a weapon found. Manuel went on, laying the grounds that someone who found the bodies could have also taken the gun from the scene. Lord Cameron interjected that if that was the case, then why hadn't this person immediately informed the authorities? When Manuel turned to the Watt case, William Watt faced the man he believed had killed his family. Manuel spoke about the meeting the two had had and how much Watt and he had discussed.
He then went for the throat. Do you remember the part of the discussion wherein you had carefully planned for months to kill your wife? That, replied Watt, is an atrocious lie. Manuel continued to grill Watt, saying things that he hoped would place doubt in the jury's mind. Whether it was true or not, which it wasn't, it was all about putting doubt into the minds of those jury members. But Manuel's questioning of Watt's movements that night was proved wrong, and his intention to lay the blame on Watt came to nothing. When Manuel's mother took the stand, her testimony didn't actually aid him, as she honestly recounted the events in question. In fact, her testimony might have been seen as somewhat detrimental to his case. Lord Cameron asked her if her son seemed to be in full possession of his faculties when he lived at home. She instantly replied yes. This effectively put an end to using mental illness as an excuse to avoid the rope. On the other hand, Samuel did his best to assist his son. He claimed that the police had threatened violence and even contributed to tarnishing Tallis's name. Samuel went on to claim that Tallis had a gun at their house shortly before the Watt murders. He was hoping he'd helped his son by planting a seed of doubt in the jury's minds. He told of how he saw his son in the police station. He seemed unlike himself, like he'd been drugged or was drunk. He continued, no, his son didn't read his confession by his own free will. It had to be dragged out of him, he claimed. Under the prosecution questioning, it was proven that he had lied about the gloves that were found being his. This discredited him, along with the fabrication of why he was arrested. He went on to say he believed the police had come about the break-ins Peter and Tallis had done. He didn't connect his son with any killings. It wasn't convincing. When Manuel took the witness stand, his response to the Anne Kneilands case was that he firmly denied killing the girl. He based his argument on the fact that the police had failed to find any evidence connecting him to the crime. During the Watt case, he attempted to insinuate that Tallis was the one who possessed the gun and committed the shooting of the Watt women. He further claimed that Tallis had left the firearm at his residence and asserted that it was Watt who had hired him for the crime. His goal was to convince the jury that Watt definitely played a role in the murders. The Smart deaths. Manuel confidently stated that he had a close relationship with Mr. Smart. He proudly mentioned that he had assisted in constructing Mr. Smart's house and had personally installed the gas supply for him. Additionally, Manuel claimed that he had shared enjoyable experiences together by attending the race events. To further emphasize their connection, Manuel embarked on a lengthy tale. In this story, he recounted an incident when William Smart had approached him, expressing concerns about a potential intruder. Manuel willingly offered his support by providing a gun to Mr. Smart. After fulfilling this favour, Manuel departed to attend a family gathering. The story was long and remarkable, and untrue. He reiterated his claims to police bullying. Judge Lord Cameron addressed the jury and delivered his summation of the case. He emphasised that Manuel should be found not guilty of the murder of Anne Kneilands, despite his confession. The judge pointed out that there was no corroboration and not a single piece of evidence to establish a connection between Manuel and the crime.
The jury retired. After 2 hours and 20 minutes, they returned with a guilty verdict. According to prison staff, Manuel seemed upbeat, cheerful and chatty during the initial days of his imprisonment while waiting for his hanging. However, there was a sudden shift in his demeanour. He became withdrawn and refused to engage in conversation with anyone, not even his parents. This behaviour persisted, and he showed no concern regarding his appeal. When taken back to court, it was thrown out, and the hanging was to go ahead. Due to Manuel's change in character, he was continuously checked by doctors for both medical and mental health needs. Experts would later give an explanation of why they thought Manuel's behaviour had drastically changed. They stated, "An attractive and clever personality, Manuel came to have an exaggerated idea of his abilities and an overweening vanity. He courted the limelight, and his ruthless egotism reacted badly and often violently to frustration and authority. However, his morbidly inflated ego was built upon a personality which was fundamentally inadequate. When this was taken away from him, it was only natural for him to give in. He knew he was going to die, and for once he realised that his lies couldn't save him. When in the death cell, he refused to wear clothes and became aggressive. He wouldn't talk with his parents on their visits or even his sister. He was again medically examined. He was watched over 24/7. Very close to his execution time, he heard there would be no reprieve from the Queen regarding his sentence. He then tried once again to push for another appeal. When he realised the mental health route wasn't going to work, he made a miraculous recovery. On the day of his execution, he put on his new suit, chatted with officers and played dominoes. Peter Manuel was sentenced to death by hanging and was hanged on Friday the 11th of July at 8 a.m. Did Peter Manuel kill others? It was believed that the police suspected him of other deaths but couldn't tie him to the victims, except one, Sidney Dunn. A man who closely matched Manuel's description was seen searching for a taxi at Newcastle railway station. He initially approached one taxi but was redirected to another. This second taxi turned out to be Mr. Dunn's vehicle. After the crime took place, both the taxi and Mr. Dunn's body were discovered by a passing police officer. Manuel had been interviewed while in prison and of course denied everything to do with it. After a long and exhausting investigation, lasting well after Manuel had been hanged, it was deduced through their investigations and some forensics that Peter Manuel was responsible. Why he did it? Well, no one knows. Down the years, Peter Manuel has been classed, rightly so, as a cold-blooded killer, with Lord Cameron stating he was the coldest person he had ever encountered. Thank you for watching.